This story was never meant to survive. Not because it lacked witnesses, not because it lacked suffering, but because someone decided it was safer if it disappeared. There are no monuments for what happened here, no plaques carved into stone, no names preserved in official records. What remains is silence, and silence, when chosen deliberately, is never empty. An entire village vanished, not in a single moment, not in a way that could be easily explained or conveniently forgotten. It vanished because it was erased. What you are about to hear was not passed down proudly. It was not written for history books. It was not meant for strangers. It survived in fragments, in whispers spoken only when the night felt too quiet, in pauses that lingered too long when certain questions were asked. And once you hear it, you may begin to understand why history chose silence instead. What happened here did not begin with violence. That is the part most people struggle to accept. There was no sudden scream that marked the beginning, no moment where the world clearly split into before and after. It began with routine, with mornings that arrived as they always had, with smoke rising gently from chimneys, with footsteps worn into familiar paths by years of repetition. People woke before the sun, not because they feared it would not rise, but because work demanded it. Hands met tools, voices met neighbors. Life moved forward with the quiet confidence of something that believed itself permanent. This belief, this dangerous illusion, was shared by everyone, because nothing had ever challenged it. The village sat in a narrow valley, sheltered by forests that had stood longer than memory itself. Trees rose densely along the slopes, their canopies thick enough to block much of the sky. To outsiders, the place felt enclosed, protected, hidden. To those who lived there, it felt safe. Stone houses leaned toward one another as if they had learned over generations that closeness was survival. Paths twisted naturally, shaped by feet rather than planning. Nothing was wasted, nothing was excessive. Life was not easy, but it was understood. And understanding creates comfort. Comfort creates trust. Trust creates vulnerability. Children played near the river, throwing stones and daring one another to step closer to the cold water's edge. Their laughter carried easily, echoing softly against the valley walls. Elders gathered beneath an old tree at the center of the village, its roots breaking through the ground like the fingers of time itself. They spoke of weather, of harvests, of stories that had been told so often they no longer felt like warnings, only tradition. Evening brought firelight, meals were shared, arguments flared and faded as they always had. No one sensed danger in familiarity. Why would they? Nothing had ever punished them for trusting it. And yet, there were signs. There are always signs. But signs are only meaningful after the fact. Before that, they are dismissed, rationalized, ignored. Animals began to change their behavior. Herds avoided certain paths they had followed for generations. Birdsong fell silent earlier than usual, leaving nights unnaturally still. Hunters spoke quietly of the forest feeling different, not hostile, just watchful. These observations were laughed away. The forest had always been strange. Silence was not uncommon. Fear, after all, needs context, and they had none.
Nights grew heavier, not darker, but thicker, the kind of darkness that feels less like absence of light and more like presence of something else. Wind sometimes carried sounds that did not belong to it, not voices, not clearly, just the sense that something had moved where nothing should have. Doors were checked twice instead of once. Fires were kept burning a little longer, but no one spoke of it openly, because speaking it would make it real, and making it real would mean admitting that safety was an illusion. There was no prophecy, no elder who stood up and said, "This is where it ends," no dream that arrived clearly enough to demand action. That is what makes this story unbearable, because nothing announced itself as a warning. History did not knock. It waited. The final days before the darkness arrived passed without ceremony. People worked fields, they repaired walls, they planned futures that would never come. There were arguments left unresolved, apologies never spoken, promises made casually with the assumption of time. Time, after all, had always been generous. Until it wasn't. When the darkness finally came, it did not come as something new. It came as something that had been approaching quietly for a long time. And by the time the village understood the truth, by the time fear replaced routine, by the time safety was recognized as a lie, it was already too late. This story is not a story of monsters. It is not a story of fate. It is not even a story of death. It is a story of people who believed they were safe, and the cost of learning otherwise. This is where the shadow begins.
Morning did not announce itself with urgency. It came softly, light filtering through mist, dew clinging to grass, breath visible in the cold air before sunrise. The first sounds were always the same. Wood creaking as doors opened, footsteps on stone paths, a distant cough, a pot placed carefully over fire. These sounds were not noticed individually. They blended into something larger, a reassurance that the world was still intact. And as long as that rhythm held, no one questioned it. The village lived by memory rather than clocks. Time was measured in tasks completed, in seasons survived, in how long it took for shadows to stretch across the valley floor. People knew when to plant by watching the forest. They knew when storms were coming by listening to the birds. They trusted instincts sharpened by generations of survival. This trust had never betrayed them, which is why, when unease crept in quietly, it went unnamed. Children grew up fast here, not because cruelty forced them to, but because responsibility was unavoidable. By the age of 10, they understood work. By 12, they understood loss. They learned which paths were safe and which were not, which silences mattered and which were simply part of the land. Stories were told at night, not to frighten, but to teach. Most of them ended the same way. Respect the forest. Do not wander alone. Listen when the land goes quiet. They were lessons learned early and then forgotten because nothing had ever happened. Not really. The elders remembered harder times, years of hunger, winters that stole the weak, diseases that moved through households like invisible thieves. But even those memories carried structure. There had always been an enemy that could be named: cold, illness, scarcity,
things you could prepare for. What was coming did not fit that pattern. It began with absences, not dramatic ones, small things. A hunter failed to return at dusk, only to appear hours later with no explanation and eyes that refused to meet anyone else's. A shepherd reported missing livestock, tracks leading nowhere, as if the ground itself had swallowed them. Someone swore they heard footsteps outside their home late at night, slow, deliberate, yet found no prints by morning. Each incident taken alone meant nothing. Together they formed something people refused to see. Conversations shifted, voices lowered, laughter ended a little too abruptly. People began standing closer together during gatherings, though no one acknowledged it. Fear rarely announces itself clearly. It hides behind caution. There was a night when the river stopped reflecting the stars. The water moved, but the surface felt wrong, thick, unresponsive to light. Those who noticed said nothing, because saying something would mean asking questions, and questions invite answers. Dreams changed. People woke suddenly, hearts racing, unable to explain why. They dreamed of being watched, of standing in familiar places that felt subtly altered, like replicas missing something essential. They dreamed of voices calling their names, never loud enough to follow, never quiet enough to ignore. Morning erased the details. Only the unease remained. One evening, a child asked a question that silenced an entire room. Why does the forest feel closer now? No one answered, because everyone felt it, but none of them had the language for it. The trees had not moved, but the space between them felt tighter, as if the valley were slowly inhaling. Animals grew restless. Dogs whined at night, staring into darkness with stiff bodies and raised fur. Horses refused to enter certain clearings, rearing suddenly, eyes wide with panic. Birds abandoned nesting grounds they had used for decades. Instinct recognized what reason refused to accept. A meeting was called, not because of panic, but because tradition demanded discussion when patterns shifted. The elders listened, they nodded, they shared stories of strange years long past. They reminded everyone that fear feeds attention, that the land had always tested them, that vigilance was enough. People wanted to believe that, so they did. Preparations were subtle. Extra food stored, tools kept closer at hand, fires tended more carefully. Not because anyone expected disaster, but because something unnamed had begun to loom. The last normal day arrived without ceremony. Sunlight touched the valley as it always had. People worked fields, children played, voices carried across open spaces. But something fundamental had shifted. The silence between sounds felt longer. The air felt heavier, as if the world were waiting. No one knew it yet, but this was the final moment of innocence, the last night before fear became unavoidable. When darkness came, it would not arrive screaming. It would arrive patient, observing, learning, and by the time the village understood what it was facing, it would already be inside.
The night it arrived was not heralded by anything recognizable. No cries, no wind howling unnaturally, no moon bleeding through clouds. It came quietly, patient, deliberate, like a shadow observing before it moved. The villagers went about their evening routines. Children returned from the river, cheeks flushed, hands wet with water. Elders tended fires and shared stories. Dinner was prepared. Doors were closed, but not locked. No one imagined a need for it. The first sign of danger was subtle. A single horse screamed in the distance. The sound carried across the valley, sharp and unnatural. Neighbors looked toward the forest's edge, but there was nothing to see. Only darkness that seemed to thicken unnaturally, swallowing the trees from the inside out. By the time more horses panicked, by the time the animals had fled in small, scattered groups, it was too late to doubt that something had come. People stepped outside. Smoke began to purl from the chimneys. Fires were lit hastily, but the air had already turned heavy, sticky. The sky itself seemed to pull downward, suffocating. Every shadow lengthened unnaturally, as though the world's edges were bending inwards. Whispers began. First one voice, then another. A man calling for his son. A woman screaming for her husband. Dogs barking frantically. The sounds mingled into chaos, but nothing answered. The darkness took shape slowly. It was not human. It was not animal. It was something else, a presence that moved through the village silently, yet felt heavy, oppressive, inevitable. Houses that had stood for generations groaned. Doors splintered, windows shattered without cause. Smoke and ash filled the streets, burning the eyes and lungs of those who tried to flee. Families separated in moments. Some ran toward the forest, hoping for concealment. Some dove into cellars, praying that what hunted them could not see beneath the earth. Others froze entirely, paralyzed by the unnameable horror before them. And those who fled discovered quickly that escape was an illusion. The paths they had walked all their lives now led to nowhere. The forest had shifted, the land had changed, or something had blocked their route. Whatever it was, it moved with intent. A child fell behind. His mother called, but the shadows swallowed her voice. A hand reached for him and disappeared before she could grasp it. Screams echoed in corridors of trees and stone. One by one, the villagers understood that the ordinary laws of the world no longer applied. No wind carried the sound away. No ground provided solid footing. Even the moonlight seemed to dissolve, leaving only a haze of gray despair. Some tried to fight. Axes swung at the approaching forms, if they could call them forms. Stones were thrown, fires were thrown into the night, but nothing reacted in the ways they expected. It felt untouched, unscathed, impenetrable. Resistance itself seemed to amuse the darkness. By midnight, the village had fallen silent. Not entirely, not all life was gone, but what remained clung to ruins, hiding in shadows, trembling. Smoke rose from burned homes, ash covered the streets, animals scattered or fled. Those who survived the initial arrival waited in trembling silence, unable to comprehend what had happened. The forest that had protected them now held only cold observation. No sound of wind, only the echo of distant despair. Morning arrived, but it brought no relief. The valley was covered in gray haze. The sun tried to rise, but the light was dull, filtered through smoke and sorrow. Homes were no longer homes. Fields were scorched. Fences lay broken. Survivors emerged cautiously.
eyes wide with shock, hands trembling, touching walls that were no longer there. They found charred remains, fragments of lives, whispers of memory. Every step carried the weight of loss. Every breath was sharp with ash. Every glance carried horror that could not be shared. Words could not capture the magnitude. The forest watched still. There were no tracks, no sign of who or what had done this, no clue to explain why the village had been chosen. The survivors realized quickly that the world had changed. Not just their village, not just the valley, the rules themselves had shifted. And the darkness was patient. It had come for them, yes, but it would not leave yet. In the aftermath of that night, time felt fractured. Minutes stretched into hours, hours stretched into days. People moved slowly, carrying only what they could grab. The familiar landmarks were now alien. Even memories seemed treacherous, reshaped by fear. The survivors clung to one another, shared what little could be salvaged: blankets, scraps of food, fragments of human connection. But each human contact was a reminder of what had been lost: family, friends, the rhythm of ordinary life. The valley was no longer safe. Even standing still, it felt like the air itself carried intent. Every shadow became a threat, every sound a potential omen. Sleep offered no sanctuary. They were awake now to history, a history written in ash, smoke, and absence. The night of the darkness had ended, but nothing would ever be the same. The forest, the valley, the ruins, all carried the memory of arrival. And so did the survivors. Each step forward was haunted, heavy, deliberate. The arrival of darkness was complete.
Morning arrived slowly, as if the sun itself feared to witness what had transpired. Smoke curled lazily from the ruins of what had once been homes. Ash floated in the air like drifting ghosts. The river ran quietly, reflecting the charred remnants of the village, a mirror of devastation. Survivors emerged cautiously, tentative, as if stepping too firmly might summon the darkness again. Eyes wide, faces smeared with soot, they carried what little they could salvage: blankets, fragments of wood, charred belongings. Some carried only memories, heavy, unrelenting memories that clung to them like a second skin. The streets were empty. No laughter, no footsteps, no one tending the fields. Silence pressed against them like a physical weight. It was heavier than fire, heavier than smoke, heavier than grief itself. A mother knelt beside what remained of her home. Her hands sifted slowly through the ashes, touching shards of memories: a scorched plate, a broken letter, a fragment of a photograph. She whispered names into the wind, names that would never answer. Children huddled together, trembling, their wide eyes reflecting everything they could not understand. One boy wandered to the riverbank, staring at the flowing water as if it could wash away the screams, the fire, the darkness. His hands traced invisible patterns in the dirt. He did not speak. No words could contain what had been lost. Survivors began to gather in small, tentative groups. They shared stories in hushed tones. Fragments of memory overlapped, creating a tapestry of grief almost unbearable to hear.
The elders, who once were keepers of history beneath the great oak, now sat among ruins. Their faces were etched with deep lines, each a scar from past battles and previous losses. They spoke quietly of the night before, of failures, of what could not be protected. And yet, in their sorrow, there was resolve, a fragile promise that the village would not be erased from memory entirely. Days passed slowly. Survivors scoured the ruins, searching for anything salvageable. Every object uncovered, a spoon, a doll, a charred piece of cloth, carried a story. Every story carried grief. At night, the forest whispered. The shadows seemed alive, carrying the echoes of screams that once filled the air. Sleep became impossible. They huddled together, listening for sounds, waiting for something they did not understand. Rebuilding was not of homes or walls, it was of memory. The village became a monument of remembrance. They placed stones where homes once stood, carved names into tree trunks, left small tokens on burned foundations. Each act was quiet defiance, a refusal to let the village be forgotten. Some survivors wandered farther, seeking help from distant villages. Others stayed, tethered to the valley by grief, by habit, by memory. Every survivor carried the same truth. The shadows of that night would follow them. The survivors began to understand a fundamental fact. Darkness could destroy homes, lives, and families, but it could not erase memory. And those who remembered were the first to defy the unforgiven. In time, small gestures returned. A fire relit in a burned home, a sapling planted in the ashes. Children learned to play again, slowly, quietly, under watchful eyes. Yet the memory of what had occurred never left. The silence was pervasive. The valley, once alive with laughter and song, now carried only the soft echoes of sorrow and the unbroken weight of absence. The survivors began to tell each other stories, stories of those lost, stories of survival, stories of what the darkness had done and what they had endured. And they whispered a lesson. Remember, forgetting is the final act of cruelty. Even in ruins, life persisted, but it was changed forever. Every step, every glance, every breath carried the memory of that night and the understanding that the world could never be trusted to remain kind. The silence and aftermath stretched endlessly. Time itself seemed suspended, and the valley waited silently, holding the secrets of the unforgiven.
The survivors spoke in whispers, not because their voices were weak, but because speaking aloud felt dangerous. Even after the night that darkness fell, there was a lingering fear, a sense that words could summon what they had barely escaped. The valley, once alive with song and laughter, now carried echoes, echoes of memories too sharp, too raw to be named. Even the wind seemed to avoid speaking freely, brushing against charred wood and empty doorways like it feared what it might disturb. Stories began to take form. Elders gathered the children near remnants of the great oak. They told stories not meant for entertainment, but as warnings. There are things in the world, they said, that do not forgive, things that watch, things that remember. Every child listened closely, their eyes wide, knowing instinctively that this was not mere myth.
The forest itself seemed to lean in, silent and patient, as if approving of the lesson. By night, the shadows moved differently. They were no longer just absence, they became active, shapes shifting at the edges of vision, whispers that seemed almost human, and voices that mimicked those long lost. Sometimes the survivors thought they recognized the sound of someone they had known, a sister's laugh, a mother's command, a father's warning. But when they turned, no one was there. The survivors learned caution. They spoke only in low tones. They traveled only in pairs or small groups. Even movement became deliberate. Nothing was allowed to be careless. Every step carried the weight of memory. Every glance carried suspicion. Every breath reminded them of the night that had stolen innocence from the valley. Some nights, the survivors would gather near the river, sharing fragments of stories too horrific to tell fully. They spoke of what they had seen, what they had heard, what they had lost. And with each whispered story, the shadows seemed to grow bolder, not attacking, not moving closer, but testing, observing, reminding them that the darkness had not ended, it had merely shifted. Months passed. The survivors adapted. They rebuilt small shelters. They planted what little could grow in the scorched soil. They lit fires carefully, at precise times, and traveled cautiously. But nothing returned to normal. The shadows remained. The echoes of that night lingered in every corner. Every sound was suspect, every flicker of light a potential harbinger. And yet, the human need to survive persisted. The valley learned to live with the shadows. The survivors learned to respect them, fear them, and remember them. Every whisper became a story. Every story became a lesson. Every lesson became survival. Silence was no longer empty. It was a presence. It was a teacher. It was a witness. And the survivors knew that as long as they remembered, the valley would continue, even if the unforgiven never forgave, even if the darkness never left.
The shadows are patient. The unforgiven never forget. And somewhere another story waits. Will you be listening when it begins?